Look at a photograph of any major city taken before 1920. Not a painting, not an illustration, a photograph. In almost every image, whether the city is in Europe, North America, the Middle East, or Asia, you will find the same structure repeated. A tall, narrow tower, sometimes attached to a building, sometimes freestanding, topped with a dome, a spire, or a pointed cap. Windows placed at irregular intervals, often no visible door at the base. We are told these were decorative, architectural flourishes, status symbols built by wealthy institutions to signal importance. That explanation exists, but it does not account for the consistency. The same proportions, the same placement ratios, the same internal geometry, across cities that had no documented contact with each other, across cultures that were supposedly building independently, across decades where travel was slow and architectural plans were not globally distributed. Something about that picture doesn't fully add up, and the closer you look at the physical evidence, the more the official explanation quietly stops answering questions. Start with the towers themselves. They appear in the historical records suddenly, not as evolving structures that started small and grew more refined over generations. They appear in the mid to late 1800s especially, already at full development, already incorporating features that engineers today describe as technically demanding. The proportions alone present a problem. Many of these towers were built to specific height-to-base ratios that modern structural engineers recognize as optimal for resonant frequency, the rate at which a structure naturally vibrates when exposed to energy. This is not folk knowledge. This is not something a craftsman working from tradition would stumble upon accidentally. Calculating resonant frequency requires either advanced mathematical modeling or a very long history of empirical trial and error, neither of which appears in the documented record of the periods and regions where these towers were built. The official explanation says, skilled craftsmen, long tradition, trial and error over centuries. But the towers do not reflect centuries of trial and error. They reflect a single, consistent design language applied fully formed across dozens of locations in a compressed time frame. That is a technical problem. Consider the towers documented across what is now the United States, built during what historians describe as a period of rapid westward expansion, the mid to late 1800s. Cities that had existed for fewer than 20 years already featured these towers. Towns with populations of a few thousand, locations where there was no architectural tradition, no established guild of craftsmen, no centuries-long building culture. Yet the towers appear, built with precision, built with materials that in many cases were sourced, processed, and installed faster than the documented labor capacity of those regions should have allowed. We are told this was the era of the railroad. Materials could be transported, workers could be mobilized. That accounts for some of it. It does not account for the uniformity of design. Railroads moved materials. They did not move a centralized architectural intention that somehow expressed itself identically in Sacramento, in Philadelphia, in Chicago, and in dozens of smaller cities simultaneously, without a central planning authority that left any documented record of issuing those designs. Now move to the material question. The stone and masonry work found in many of these towers, and in the larger buildings they were attached to, shows characteristics that confuse modern restoration specialists, not because the work is rough, because the work is too precise. Mortar joints measured at consistent widths across entire facades, stone blocks fitted with tolerances that, when tested, fall within ranges that modern contractors associate with machine-assisted cutting. Curved surfaces on towers that maintain their curvature within margins that would require either extraordinary craftsmanship or a form of measurement tool not documented in the construction records of the period. Restoration teams working on 19th century civic buildings in the United States and Europe have noted in technical reports that receive very little public attention that replicating sections of original stonework using period-accurate tools and methods takes significantly longer than the original construction timeline suggests is possible. That gap between what the timeline says happened and what the physical evidence suggests would have required is not acknowledged in the standard historical account. It is noted in technical literature. It does not reach the general explanation. The pattern becomes more specific when you look at what these towers were connected to. In city after city, the towers were not isolated monuments. They were attached to, or positioned near, specific types of buildings. Train stations, civic halls, hospitals, hotels, universities, exhibition halls, not churches primarily, not military structures, not private residences. The selection is precise enough to suggest function, but the official record describes no shared function. These towers are catalogued as aesthetic choices made by individual architects expressing individual creative visions, and yet the same aesthetic choice made by supposedly independent architects producing the same structural type, at the same height ratios, attached to the same categories of institution, across multiple continents. At what point does an aesthetic coincidence become a pattern that requires a different explanation? Go further back. The towers of the 19th century are not the beginning of this pattern. They appear to be a continuation of something older. Look at the minarets of the Islamic world, the stupas of South and Southeast Asia, the towers of pre-Columbian Mesoamerica, the round towers of Ireland, the towers of the ancient Near East. Different cultures, different belief systems, different materials, different stated purposes. The same structural logic, narrow base relative to height, specific taper ratios, elevated placement of the widest internal chamber, acoustic properties that researchers studying several of these structures have described as non-incidental, meaning the sound behavior inside these towers is too specific and too consistent to be the result of random construction choices. The official explanation for each of these tower traditions is cultural and religious. The minaret calls the faithful to prayer. The stupa marks a sacred location. The round tower provided refuge. These explanations describe use. They do not explain why the structural geometry is consistent across cultures that were not in contact. You can explain the stated purpose of a container without explaining why all the containers are the same shape. The acoustic question deserves more attention than it receives. Researchers studying ancient stone structures have documented, repeatedly and across multiple independent investigations, that certain chambers and towers produce specific acoustic effects, standing waves, sound focusing, frequency resonance at ranges that correspond to human brainwave states. This is measurable. This has been measured. The papers exist in acoustic archaeology and archaeoacoustics literature going back several decades. The findings are not disputed. They are simply not incorporated into the mainstream explanation of why these structures were built. The standard response is that the acoustic properties are incidental, that builders were optimizing for other structural goals, and the sound behavior was a byproduct. This is possible, but it becomes harder to maintain when you find the same acoustic profiles and structures across Ireland, Peru, Turkey, India, and Cambodia. Structures built by cultures with no documented connection to each other across timeframes spanning thousands of years. Incidental similarity does not typically reproduce itself this consistently, across this much distance and time. Return to the 19th century towers and ask a different question, not how they were built. Ask what happened to them. Because most of them are gone, not damaged by war, not lost to natural disaster, not fallen into ruin through neglect, deliberately demolished. Cities across the United States removed these towers from civic buildings, train stations, and hotels in a concentrated period roughly between 1910 and 1940. The official reason given in most cases, structural deterioration. The towers had become unsafe. But the buildings they were attached to, in many cases, were preserved, extended, renovated, sometimes landmarked. The towers specifically were removed. In a smaller number of cases, the buildings themselves were demolished entirely and replaced. The replacement structures are notable for what they lack. The new train stations, the new civic halls, the new hotels, they do not have towers. The architectural tradition, which had been continuous and global, stops almost simultaneously. And the replacement buildings that follow do not attempt to continue it. This is treated in architectural history as a shift in aesthetic preference. The ornate gave way to the modern. Functionalism replaced decoration. That explanation accounts for the stylistic change. It does not explain why the demolitions were concentrated in time. It does not explain why the structural reports justifying demolition in so many cases describe similar failure modes in buildings that were constructed with materials and methods that, by contemporary engineering standards, should not have failed at the rate the record suggests they did. There is a category of evidence that receives almost no discussion in the context of this pattern. Photographs. The late 19th and early 20th century was a period of extensive photographic documentation. Cities were photographed systematically. Postcards, municipal records, newspaper archives. The visual record of this period is substantial, and in that visual record, the towers are present. Clearly, repeatedly, unmistakably present on buildings that are still standing today without them. Compare a photograph of a major train station from 1895 to the building as it stands today. In some cases, what you are looking at is structurally the same building, same walls, same footprint, same basic volume, but with a different roofline and no towers. The buildings survived, the towers did not, and in the photographic record, there is something else worth noting. Some of these towers appear in photographs showing damage, not the kind of damage associated with weather or settling. Damage patterns that engineers who have examined the images, outside the context of official interpretation, describe as consistent with high-energy discharge events. Scorching at specific points, structural deformation at the apex rather than the base, which is the opposite of what gravitational failure or wind damage would produce. These are observations about photographic evidence. They raise a question about the official explanation of structural deterioration. They do not answer that question. Consider what the towers have in common with another category of structure that also disappeared from public use in roughly the same period: the large, multi-story exhibition buildings of the late 19th century. The buildings constructed for World's Fairs and international expositions in Chicago, in Paris, in St. Louis, and Philadelphia. These buildings were constructed in very short time frames, months in some cases, for structures covering hundreds of thousands of square feet. The official explanation is industrial-era construction capacity, prefabricated elements, large labor forces, efficient organization. That explanation is reasonable. What is harder to explain is the quality, not the scale, the quality. Visitors at the time described interior surfaces, acoustic properties, and lighting effects that contemporary accounts struggled to attribute to temporary exhibition structures. Some of these buildings were described as producing internal environments, temperature, acoustics, light diffusion, that visitors found difficult to explain given the materials visibly present. And then these buildings were demolished. Almost all of them. In very short periods after the expositions ended. We are told the demolitions were planned from the beginning, temporary structures for temporary events. But the construction investment, by the labor and material cost records that survive, does not match temporary construction logic. You do not build to that quality for a 2-year exhibition if you are operating on normal industrial economics. There is a broader pattern here that connects the towers to the exposition buildings to a wider set of structures from the same period that share common characteristics: high construction quality relative to documented build time, materials and finishes that exceed what the official labor and tool record suggests should have been achievable, buildings that served functions described as civic or commercial but that incorporate structural features, acoustic properties, geometric precision, specific proportional ratios that go beyond what those functions require. And then, in a concentrated period, many of these structures are removed. The official history of this removal describes it as modernization. Progress. The old making way for the new. That framework fits some of what happened. It does not fit the selectivity. Modernization does not consistently remove specific structural features, the towers, the specific acoustic chambers, the specific proportional geometries, while preserving the buildings around them. Something specific was being removed. What that something was, what function it may have served, what knowledge produced it, is precisely what the official record does not address. Now ask the question that the pattern eventually forces. If this design tradition, these towers, these proportional systems, these acoustic geometries, was consistent enough to appear globally in cultures with no documented contact across thousands of years, and then concentrated enough to appear again in the 19th century across multiple continents simultaneously, and sophisticated enough to require technical knowledge not reflected in the documented construction record. Where did that knowledge come from? The standard answer is it developed independently. Parallel development. Human beings in different places solving similar problems with similar tools and arriving at similar solutions. Parallel development is a real phenomenon. It explains some convergences. It becomes strained as an explanation when the convergences are this specific, when we are not talking about the general shape of a pointed structure, but about precise internal ratios, specific acoustic properties, and consistent placement patterns relative to other civic functions. Parallel development produces approximate similarity. What we are looking at in these structures is not approximate, it is specific. Specific enough that when modern researchers attempt to reverse engineer the design logic, they find mathematical relationships that were not rediscovered by Western science until the 19th and 20th centuries. The structures predate the rediscovery of the principles they appear to embody. That is not a claim. That is a measurable observation about the relationship between the geometry of these structures and the history of the mathematical and physical principles they express. There is a way that institutions currently handle this gap. Museums catalog the structures. Preservation organizations protect the surviving examples. Academic papers describe their dimensions, their materials, their construction sequences. The descriptions are meticulous. What the descriptions consistently avoid is the question of method. How is this calculated? What tool produced this tolerance? What knowledge system generated this consistency across unconnected cultures? These questions appear occasionally in specialist literature. They tend to appear in the methodology sections of papers focused on other questions. Papers about acoustic properties or structural engineering analysis, or materials science applied to ancient construction. In those contexts, a researcher will note, the precision of this feature is difficult to account for using the tools and methods attributed to this period. And then, the paper moves on. The observation is made. It is not pursued. It is not incorporated into the larger explanation. The evidence remains. The explanation remains incomplete, and the institutional response to that incompleteness is, consistently, to continue cataloging the physical evidence while not revising the methodological explanation. Look at what survives. Some of these towers are still standing. A smaller number than once existed, but enough to examine. Stand at the base of one of these structures and look up. The taper is not random. The window placement is not decorative. The materials were selected and placed according to a logic that the structure itself still expresses, even if the documentation of that logic has not survived. Researchers who have measured these surviving towers against each other and against the towers and photographs of demolished examples find consistent geometric relationships. Relationships that suggest not individual architectural creativity, but a shared template, a standard that was being applied. Where is the documentation of that standard? It does not exist in the archives. Not in the form you would expect. Not as a design manual, not as a guild specification, not as an academic treatise. The standard is visible in the physical evidence. It is absent from the written record. That gap between physical evidence and documentary record is itself a form of information. When knowledge exists in objects but not in documents, the conventional explanation is that the knowledge was practical, passed through apprenticeship, through direct instruction, through doing rather than writing. But practical knowledge transmitted through apprenticeship does not produce global consistency. An apprenticeship tradition in France does not explain why a tower in Ohio and a tower in Egypt share the same internal ratios. The period of concentrated demolition, roughly 1910 to 1940, coincides with other changes in the built environment that are also noted but not fully explained. The shift away from natural materials toward industrial concrete and steel. The disappearance of certain surface treatments, the polished, sometimes metallic, appearing finishes found on many of the older civic buildings in photographs, but absent from the buildings that replace them. The progressive simplification of civic architecture toward forms that, whatever their aesthetic merits, do not incorporate the geometric and acoustic properties of the structures they replaced. Whether these changes are connected is a question the official architectural history does not ask. But the simultaneity is real. Multiple specific features of the built environment, the towers, the surface treatments, the proportional systems, the acoustic design, disappear in the same period, replaced by structures that are functional, durable, and thoroughly documented in their design and construction. The documentation that was missing from the earlier tradition appears in full for the later one, as though the earlier tradition operated from a knowledge base that did not leave records. And when that tradition ended, what replaced it was something entirely new, designed according to principles that were being articulated for the first time. There is a question that sits underneath all of this. Not whether these structures existed. They did, and many still do. Not whether they were built with precision. They were, and the measurements confirm it. The question is, what the precision was for. Structures built to optimize resonant frequency, designed with specific acoustic properties, placed at consistent locations relative to specific functions, appearing globally without a global communication network to distribute the design, and then removed in a concentrated period. These facts do not assemble themselves into a clean explanation. The official framework, aesthetic tradition, independent parallel development, modernization, accounts for parts of the pattern. It does not account for the whole. And the whole is what the physical evidence presents. The towers that still stand are measurable. The towers that were demolished are visible in photographs. The geometric relationships between them are calculable. The acoustic properties of surviving examples are recordable. The knowledge that produced them is not in the archive. Consider what it would mean if the 19th century towers were not a new tradition. If they were instead a continuation. Or a reconstruction, a reapplication of a design standard that had existed for much longer, that appears in the minarets and stupas and round towers not as independent invention, but as inherited practice, carried forward through means that the conventional history of knowledge transmission does not account for. That possibility is not provable with current evidence. But it is also not ruled out by current evidence. And it raises a specific question about the 19th century tower building period. If those builders had access to a design standard older than the period suggests, where did they encounter it? What was the source? And what was removed when the towers were demolished? The structures themselves, or something the structures were part of? The physical record suggests the demolitions were deliberate and selective. Deliberate selective removal implies that what was removed had a specific identity. That it was recognized as a specific thing, not merely as old construction. What that thing was, what the towers represented, what they may have done, what knowledge produced them, and what knowledge was lost when they were gone. The archive does not say. The structures that remain do not explain themselves, and the gap between what was built and what was recorded stays exactly where it has always been. Open, measurable, unresolved.